everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. I'm Caitlin McGurk, Associate Curator and Assistant Professor at the Ohio State University Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. This is my cat Zeke over here. We'll see how long he lasts in this frame. With me this afternoon is someone whose work I deeply admire and whose friendship is one I am so grateful for. Josh Baer has worked as a cartoonist and illustrator for the past 2 decades. His books include Theth, Raw Power, RM, Black Star, and Theth Tomorrow Forever, which was actually just nominated for an Ignatz Award for Outstanding Comic. He is the editor of Suspect Device and All Time Comics, and his work has been selected for inclusion in the Best American Comics Anthology in 2014 and 2017. Baer also has an extensive career producing conceptual art for a variety of TV and film productions for clients including MTV and HBO. And my personal favorite is Josh Baer fun fact is that his artwork appears in the background of the Smashing Pumpkins music video for Bullet with Butterfly Wings, which is brother directed. Josh lives in Harlem and teaches comics professionally at schools all over New York City, as well as professional art workshops for clients such as Facebook and Kickstarter. Josh is most proud of having worked with the hardcore band Integrity, for whom he produced a limited edition album art for the release of Humanity is the Devil, re-release of Humanity is the Devil. For me, Josh's work has the ancestral feel of humankind's earliest scrawls. His cartooning style is seriously unlike anything I've ever seen. Raw is definitely a word for it, but I think primal cuts even closer. But don't mistake primal for primitive. Josh's work is anything but simple. It is a masterfully executed output of pure energy and emotion, just unrelenting and elemental. About Theth Tomorrow Forever, comics historian Paul Toomey said, "The comics have a strong visceral feeling that bypass the cognitive mind in a magical way. The ever-shifting, melting, hallucinogenic images reflect as much about the character's inner landscape as his environment." If I didn't know better personally, I would think Josh's comics were drawn in like blood and saliva. That's how organic they feel. So welcome, Josh Baer, to CXC.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. And as promised, since we can't be on the same stage together, to fill in the gap where we're supposed to shake hands, I did a super realistic drawing of us shaking hands. I did it a bunch of times trying to get it just right.
It's beautiful. I love it. I can feel the clutch. How are you doing today, Josh?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm super excited that we're having this conversation, especially this year that Theth Tomorrow Forever came out.
Yeah, me too.
Specifically for, Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, because Theth Tomorrow Forever takes place in Columbus. Right. And, it's funny because I think that we have had kind of reverse experiences in life. For anyone who hasn't read this book or Theth 1, it takes place in Columbus, and it's evident from reading it that you had some of like the worst years of your life in Columbus and then the best years in New York City, where you are now. And I grew up in New York and moved to Columbus almost a decade ago, and the opposite has been true for me. But my Columbus and your Columbus are extremely different places. So, can you tell me a little bit about what it was like for you growing up here?
Yeah, and that's not really a reflection of like where Columbus was at during those years. I think it has more to do with, personal stuff and my home dynamic.
Totally.
But it was a different town. I think when I've visited, the few times I visited in the last 25 years, feels like it feels more cosmopolitan, and it feels more like it's got more of like a carnival atmosphere. It's like it feels like people are really excited and out and about and excited to use the resources, and resources were kind of sparser then. It was much more, it was different. And my experience, during the period where Theth Tomorrow Forever takes place, I was living in circumstances that were pretty similar to Theth. My apartment was over on 2nd and 2nd.
Okay.
I think think I can't remember if I drove past. It was sort of a beautiful building. It was like it looked kind of like Melrose Place. Like there was kind of a courtyard, and I was on the corner apartment, which I found out when my heat got shut off, made it even colder. And the yeah, it was dirt cheap. My rent was 150 a month if I remember right.
Oh my God.
And my friends were like, when I've talked to people since then, they were like, yeah, Columbus rent was cheap, but your rent was really cheap. Like friends were all paying like 400, 300, $500 a month.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, the city is definitely dramatically different from what I've heard. Like, I have no context outside of reading things like your books and then talking to people who are from here for what it was like before, especially neighborhoods like the Short North, which are night and day from what I understand. I remember when I first moved here, someone telling me how throughout the Short North there used to be like actual like bumpers along the side of the road to stop drunk people from falling into the street
oh, I
because
don't
of how
remember.
much like partying was done and stuff. I mean, it's part of campus,
Oh
but
yeah, yeah, I do remember
uh,
that. Yeah, they would have. They looked like kind of like not. They're plastic if I remember right.
yeah,
Like netting, like you would have underneath. Like yeah, that's absolutely they would do that. I never really made that connection. I mean, because I didn't drink, so I'd just be like, I got the sense that they were for hurting people, yeah, the streets were completely thronged with drunk people at night, right around where Crazy Mama's was.
yeah,
And it's funny because there's always something that's missing from whatever era you're there. There was something that was a little bit that was lost, like that was there 10 years beforehand. Like I moved to campus in 88 and I'll see photos from shows that were just fucking epic that I missed, like seeing Sam Hain or at Neely B's or like the Black Flag show in like 85 or 86. Like there was like there's that guy Jay Photoman whose photos are all over Facebook and Twitter, and some of the shows that he took pictures that I was at, but there was some there was a real lightning in a bottle kind of aspect to some of the shows that I missed that were there a few years before me.
yeah, yeah. Did you ever go to shows at Bernie's? Is that a familiar spot for you? That was across the street from the cartoon library until fairly recently when they leveled that whole block for condos.
Well, it was sort of like I saw the Akana Thugs there and other like local bands. I think like maybe like the people like that everybody loved, but people only knew in Columbus. I saw there, but my favorite Columbus local band was Soul Scrape, and then they eventually became Overjoy, and my friend John Flesher sang for them, and I thought they were like a world class band. They were like the Swans. They were like when you listen to the Gods with a Z, like they're like an all-time good band. They're kind of scummy. They're good. Like they were on, I think they were signed to the same Cleopatra Records later on, maybe like the same label, or maybe a label that Kiss owned or something. If
Okay.
you ever heard the Gods with a Z,
Mm-mm.
gotta check them out. They had a song called the Gods Rock and Roll Machine, and they used to play it on QFM 96, and I still have it memorized because it has a whole spoken word part about who the gods are and what their mission statement is. That's why we have long hair. We're the ones your parents warned you about. And it's like and they were you can find them on Spotify, Gods with a Z. And Overjoy and Soul Scrape was like the same caliber. Like they were a good band by any yardstick. There's other bands that got really big, like New Bomb Turks.
Oh
They were
yeah, I'm friends with
correct,
yeah,
probably right.
one,
Yeah,
yeah,
they were cool. I was a little bit. I wasn't really their audience though. They were kind of doing something I'm starting to get into now, like kind of this faster, more fun punk.
yeah,
Um, I liked Overjoy because they weren't fun. They were super serious.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, no, but you know where I did see a kind of an unlikely show was in at the Euro place. Um, geez, I'm drawing a blank. I saw the Laughing Hyenas play at the Euro place that was like halfway in between, like halfway down the Short North, like kind of. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. I can't. Apollo's. a punk.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That place is actually still there. So,
I think he told me that, yeah.
yeah.
And it was so unlikely that they would have shows there,
Yeah.
much less like a Laughing Hyena show. And they were laughing. It was such it felt like so DIY, like seeing
Yeah.
a band there at a venue where you could still smell the food cooking in the background. And that was an amazing show. But most of the shows that we saw were at stashes.
Mhm.
Um, and and then I'd see, that was the thing about being there in '88. I saw like Danzig and X and the Circle Jerks. I saw them all at the Newport.
That's so amazing,
So
though.
it was all great, but it was a little big. They
Yeah,
were going up
yeah.
to the
So, I
next
mean, it just
level.
seems like Columbus had a way, way grittier feel than it does now. And that really comes through in all of the comics that you depict Columbus in. Like, do you feel like that environment really affected you and your art style?
Yeah, very much. And I was like, you can see it in my book that I'm really I'm still tying the art into the DNA of a lot of that music, and the experience of discovering punk was a watershed moment for me in high school and everything.
Yeah,
Uh,
I want to hear more about that because I love how in That's Tomorrow Forever, uh, Wendy O. Williams from the Plasmatics is like both your like ultimate sexual fantasy, but also like your fairy godmother and like sitting on your shoulder. Like, yeah. How does punk inform your art?
well, the experience, like what I went to when I was a kid, like we lived in Forest Park, and then we moved. My dad married my stepmom. We moved to Upper Arlington, which is like the expensive suburb, but we were like the poorest, not the poorest, because there actually were poor people in Upper Arlington that were poorer than us. I saw them when I did my paper route. But yeah, I was going to school with kids who were a lot more well heeled. And I remember like in music class, we had a fun day after playing recorders all year, that we could bring in music from our collection and do like a book report on them. And I was like, I'm 12 years old. These kids have a music collection. And sure enough, they did. So like this one kid in class, you'd have these jock kids coming in, and it was like their day to talk about Def Leppard. And they had like a sleeveless British flag t-shirt and a bandana and every Def Leppard album. They lined them up. And I remember being like, trying to tell the difference between Rick Springfield and Bruce Springsteen, because I always got them confused. And I was like, I didn't really know who anybody was. And I thought there was something kind of wrong with me, that I didn't really love like music. I mean, I liked like Jump by Van Halen and other shit that everybody was into, but I didn't really love anything. I thought, and then when I discovered certain bands, it was in high school when I was like 17. It was a real validating moment, because I was like, even the art kids in high school, they all listened to the Smiths and the Cure. And there's one other, they all had Walking on the Beach, the singles. They all had the Queen is Dead. And there was one other thing, and they were all in agreement that those bands were great. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. That's cool. It seemed the new wave stuff is kind of okay. And then I discovered the Birthday Party and the Gun Club, and I
Mm.
was, why is no, like, what's his name? Mark L. Lang, the guy from Screaming Trees, just wrote a book, and
Mhm.
he has a beautiful passage about discovering the Gun Club, how it was like, um, he had a lot of passion for it. It's like, this is music that was like written in blood, that was like exactly what I wanted to do. And
Yes.
I remember being like, really being truly falling in love with that music,
Yeah.
and then being like, well, cool, this stuff is good, and Gun Club is obviously good. A lot of hardcore I still thought was kind of dumb music, and then I started to slowly be like, discovered the Birthday Party, and I was like, whoa, I'm like, okay, maybe I can listen to shit that is this hard if somebody that's intelligent is doing it.
Mm.
And it was because it was obviously an art project. It was obviously, when the lyrics were strangely like a meditation on language,
Oh,
and
yeah.
sort of bringing it back to a real, yeah. And it was And then I was like, well, yeah, okay, so I'm into this stuff. All the dudes running around with like shaved heads. I don't know why they're so passionate about a lot of this other music. And then slowly one album led to another, led to another. And I literally would walk around when I was at CCAD for a year in 88. I remember, I don't think I had a Walkman, but I remember being so obsessed with the birthday party that I would like walk around like when I wanted to put myself in a better mood or try to kind of block out what was around me. I'd like kind of repeat the lyrics like over and over again.
Mm.
And as you see in Theft, I was struggling to do my art. So having having my own voice was a little bit out of my was out of grasp for me. It was a bit of a phantom that I was chasing for years for a bunch of reasons. And I was kind of started to relegate myself to being more of an obsessive music fan,
Mhm.
and who would kind of vent his frustration that way. And unfortunately, I kind of stayed in that zone through most of my 20s. Like I stopped really having faith that I could express myself through comics, especially.
Mm.
And this is something I discussed with my students a lot. I got sort of stuck in a cycle where I was sort of chasing my own tail, kind of getting very confused about, getting self-conscious and confused about the approach that you needed to take with my work, confused about ideas that I'd been exposed to in art school. Like when I read that Francis Bacon, that he would refuse to do any kind of preparatory image making for his work, because for him it wasn't you weren't really witnessing the lightning in a bottle action of making art unless you saw the evidence of the brush hitting the canvas for the first time. So he stopped priming his canvases, and I was just like, oh my, I got to be authentic because you're that age and authenticity is so important. So I got very confused about how to work that into my comics practice. And of course I dropped out of school. So I was trying to figure this stuff out on my own. And I ended up just walking around and kind of juggling through a lot of ideas about what high art meant and what a cartoonist had to do, and not being able to reconcile them. So
Yeah.
yeah, the music kind of took the place that that the comics maybe would have. I stayed in love with comics, but I was getting very jaded because
Mm.
it wasn't a simple matter of looking at the comics and then sitting in your house and doing them. So that's what I really wanted. But I kept on imploding.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, like, how early did you start making comics? And especially when you were doing this kind of work, or any of the kind of work that you were doing in art school, does it still have the feel that your work does now? Or were you at one point someone who did do these like super highly rendered, overly labored type of pieces, and it's taken, this time for you to evolve into having this kind of looseness? Or was that always kind of part of your aesthetic?
It's always kind of like it is now. I have like very few comics from when I was a kid, but I actually drew comics pretty obsessively as a kid. In my house, my brothers were unusually like perfection oriented about comics. So my brother Sam, who you mentioned before, who became like a big creative person in the real world. He was a music video director, and a film director, and a commercial director. And he was kind of the sort of the patriarch of the house in a lot of ways. And he would do these really detailed comics they had to be like 20 pages at least.
Mm.
They're usually like 25 if I remember. They had to be fully inked. They had to be colored. And so
Wow.
when you'd see my friends at school would come in with the comics that were just in pencil, and I'd be like, they'd be 5 pages, and I'd always think that's not real. This is what a real comic looks like. So when I started doing comics, I also had to do that. And and of course you're always comparing yourself. We talked about 1988 Columbus comparing itself to 85, and 1994 Columbus comparing itself to 88, and 2005 Columbus comparing itself to 95, and looking at what's missing. And there's a similar, I was always thinking my stuff was a horribly average version of what my brothers were doing.
Mm.
My brother John did them as well. My brother Dan did them too, but less so, probably because we all shit on him so much for his stuff not being like, he was kind of better at school and we kind of needed art more. And
Yeah.
so I even though I was a younger brother, I was always telling him his comments are shit because I'm a real asshole about it. And he might have cultivated more of a practice otherwise. But it's kind of a group dynamic thing too, is that you usually, I mean, I got my share of being the odd man out as the youngest, and as being and the stupidest. And we'd all pick on each other. So
It was
he
three
became
boys,
four.
four boys. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah.
And so I gave him, I think the other brothers did too, gave him a lot of we all gave each other negative reinforcement, except for Sam, because we were all scared of him. And then he would, my brother John too, who I was scared of as well, he would do comics, and they were amazing as well. They were really, and I deal with them a lot in my new book, but they were they looked like they had this kind of like crude early Christian, like artwork quality to them. Like
Huh.
they were really wonderful, and none of those exist anymore. Very folk art looking, kind of like a cross between like kind of Chagall like, and they were very obsessive and angry and great in their own way as well.
Hmm.
So my stuff looked like that, and then I became a high school. Well, then my parents stopped letting me do comic books because which was sort of like a punitive measure. Like you're not.
I was, yeah, I was curious well, in general, how much of theft is really exact to your life story, but also like,
His parents are
was
less
there
mean.
art encouragement? I mean, were your parents artistic? Like, or you guys just kind of got that on your own
My
and
mom
fed off
painted.
each other?
My mom was a painter, and
Mhm.
she was I think she was a fashion illustrator major in college, or that was a minor.
Yeah.
And she was very art friendly, but she passed away when I was 4. And uh, we all loved art. We're obsessed with comics. My dad would have bursts of anger about it, but in most ways, he would look the other way when I did my comics. And then my stepmother married. The parents in theft are less mean than my parents, because it's not. I don't want to be one of those narratives where you're charting up all the injustices, but and it just it imbalances the narrative if I really get into like what they were like. But they were they were like, you're not allowed to do these. At one point they tried to bargain with me and say that I could only do comics if they're educational, and if my dad like wrote up a bunch of rules, like I could only have them use powers if the powers like made sense scientifically.
Hmm.
And it was like really sad. You're not supposed to put you can put in like sort of impose limitations are really positive for your work if you really are, if you're a mature artist.
Sure.
It's
Yeah. I know what
you
that
do it
is, though.
you do it too early, and it's sort of like the kids just like, why I'm not even going to bother doing this. So they stopped me pretty cold from doing work. And then as I got to be like 17, maybe even a little bit younger, I started to be like, fuck them, they can't watch me every minute. And I did one long narrative when I would think I was 16. It was pretty like like it was like very kind of art, more like on the arty end of things. And then when I discovered Raw Comics and Mark Bayer, I started doing stuff that I wanted to look really primitive, and did a couple of comics in high school, right when I was getting out of high school, that were flat, with all the heads looked like had a kind of a Easter Island like flat graphic
Mhm.
quality to them. And
Yeah,
some of that stuff still exists.
that's cool. And it's interesting because well, CCAD is a big part of CXC. They now have a comics and narrative practice or something like that. I can't remember the exact term for it, major. And it's one of the only schools in the country that has one. But I know from stories, even from someone like Jeff Smith, who went there briefly, that was not always the case, that they were particularly accepting of it. So, I mean, what was your experience like in art school? And was your only experience with art school early on CCAD? I know you got a degree much later.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I went to school. I had like a partial scholarship, and my grandfather had he had died in a car wreck, and he had left me some money. So I used like I think the tuition was like $12,000, and I had to pay like $6,000, and then I didn't live in the dorms, or else it would have been 9,000.
Yeah.
And I does that sound right? Yeah. And I went there for a year. Um, yeah, it was the teacher did not. I wouldn't say I had anybody uh frown on comic related artwork. It was more like there was a complete absence of its
Yeah.
presence at the school. I had a painting teacher who one day said, you know, that he was friendly towards comics, and they thought a lot of Art Crumb's work was really beautiful, but it wasn't exactly the same as having people really cultivate, you doing comics in school. There
Yeah.
were that teacher actually said something to me though that I still use to this day when I teach people and when I think about how to make successful work, which is
Yeah.
a really out of the box thing to say. He said the success of every drawing has to do with what happens when one line crosses over another and how you resolve that. And he just said it and then left it up to me to think about what he meant. And I thought about it again and again because it was one of the few little threads that I could really retain. Like in my 2D design class, the teacher would try to teach about compositions and by arranging like rectangles and triangles. And I honestly had a lot of cognitive dissonance in that class, and for years thought that I couldn't understand composition. And so like I'm 50 now, and it's only like this year that I can genuinely talk about like understanding why it works when you have 3 vertical slashes and 2 sort of slightly diagonal horizontal slashes, and relating to Franz Klein and things like that. And she would talk about grouping shapes, and I never could figure out she could never really make it come alive for me, and I hated the assignments.
Yeah.
That the teacher said about the line, I went back to again and again.
Hmm. That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, were you at that point going to like places like CMA a lot or experiencing a lot of fine art, and did any of it kind
Oh,
of
Columbus
like
Museum.
did your sorry, Columbus Museum of Art, our local abbreviation, CMA. I mean, did any of that kind of like really latch onto you? You mentioned Francis Bacon, so
Yeah, George Tucker, and I looked it up the other day. This image that George Tucker did. People who don't know, George Tucker is like up there, Paul Camus and Thomas Hart Benton, and Charles White as being like this amazing example of the social realist movement. And when I was a kid, I would go to the museum on class trips and whatnot, and the George Tucker piece always stood out to me. It looked kind of like a cartoon, and the image that's there, I just looked it up and saw that it's still owned by the museum. Whether
mm,
it's still being displayed there, I don't know. And it was, or it's housed by the museum. They don't own it. And it's an image of a man on a ledge, kind of looking down at the viewer. And it looks like nothing else. But his body language and the kind of Diego Rivera, his
mhm,
stuff has a real sense of like having an outline. Um,
mm,
not to the point where it looks like a cartoon, but you can see it in his original work. He'll do a full black charcoal outline around everything and fill it up with paint. And
mm.
that gives it, that look gives it a certain feeling that relates it to comics. And Tucker stuff has the same feeling. It's very, it's so yeah, that experience jumps out at me.
Yeah,
Can't
that
say, can't say a lot of the other pieces that I really had the bandwidth to appreciate them.
sure, yeah. I mean, that makes me really wanna go and see if they have that piece currently in display. I'm gonna have to find out exactly which one it is, but I mean, so in Seth Tomorrow Forever, one of the opening scenes is Seth, like, being drawn to this particular comic book cover that, is it supposed to be Dick Briefer's Frankenstein? And was that what it actually was for you?
Yeah, it was. There was a few comics that I wanted to play with. You can't when you're writing, of course, especially something that's not autobiography, but what I think Daniel Clowes had a really good description of his work, his early work, being like emotional autobiography.
Yeah.
It it is yeah, you pick stuff, you make some stuff up and you recreate some stuff. And there was a bunch of comics that had that I could have substituted for the Dick Briefer comic. One I considered doing the Mr. Monster Presents issues that reprinted Jack Cole's work,
Hmm.
uh, because they both had a similar effect on me. I was exposed to Pettibone's zines. I was exposed to magazine called Chemical Imbalance that I got at Singing Dog Records, which just shows you like what a cultural resources record stores were.
Oh
That
yeah.
that magazine is where I saw Joe Coleman, was further exposed to Pettibone, further exposed to Panther, who I'd probably seen before, but I saw even more of his work. He had a portrait that he did of Philip K. Dick's. People that aren't around anymore. Like there's an artist whose name is like Y27 or something, just numbers. And he did amazing punk rock art that was reprinted in Chemical Imbalance. But as for the Dick Briefer comic, yeah, that was a real thing. I didn't find it on the newsstand. I found it at Monkey's Retreat Records. So
Hey, yeah, that's awesome. Those guys are still around and they're part of CXC most years. They sell back issues and stuff.
the original guys,
Yep.
wow, I'd love to see them again. They were wonderful to me. They
Yeah,
were,
they're great.
I mean, and I said records, I meant comics, Retreats comics. Yeah, they were around all the time. I never bought a comic. I would never steal from them, but
Uh,
I would go in and just read their fucking comics from one after the other. And it was horrible. And they were nothing but not benign to me. I mean, Julie Duché, I saw her stuff there. So now you're doing a little bit later because that was more like 90, 91.
yeah.
And Steven, they had a great underground section. And again, between them and the record stores, you could be exposed to stuff that was very significant. It was part of movements that were really happening other places other than Columbus. Seeing Pettibone stuff I never saw in stores, but friends would pass it on to me. And I saw like stuff that was probably from like 86. I saw like in 88. So it was still very recent. And that was all the stuff had the same cumulative effect. It was brilliantly inspiring, but also very crushing. And I had all these moments that are recorded in Theft that are Theft Tomorrow Forever is very much about the kind of dream that we have, that kind of American um, uh, self-invention story that
Mm.
you see what people are doing, and if you're industrious, you sit down and you apply yourself and you pull yourself up from your bootstraps. And I was trying to do everything on my own, and it was Death Tomorrow Forever is a little bit about what if you do all these things and you just can't get it together because you're a fuck up. And that is what's that story like, where it all builds up to be like it's going to be the person who slams her fist on the table and is like, uh no more, no more like weakness and confusion. I'm going to do this work because I love it, because I said that stuff to myself all the time and then I'd still fuck up.
It's such an accurate description or depiction of that struggle. Like, I especially love everything where in Theft Tomorrow Forever at the diner, where it's like, looks like you're just kind of moving papers around. Like, that's literally what I do every time I'm trying to work on like a writing project or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, people can't see the subconscious part of that process, but I think you capture that really, really well. And I mean, yeah, exposure to all of that different art aesthetics. And I'm just, you can really feel Theth walking around Columbus and like having this music blasting and also having these comic book images going through his head. And just the way that you are able to capture how that works out in the subconscious of this character in the same way that it worked out in your own subconscious is fascinating. I mean, I think everyone who has any kind of artistic or creative lean has those kind of things. For me, it was like the covers of different VHS tapes at my local store that would like burn into my brain and they're still there. But you do this thing where you have it's like we're watching you process, or watching Seth through you process all of these different images and influences out onto the page. And something that I think is really fascinating about your body of work, especially your most recent body of work, like Black Star and RM, Seth One and Seth Forever, are how they all kind of not just take place in the same universe, but they all reference each other in different ways. So, in particular, I'm fascinated by how there are comics within comics in these works, whether that's ROM, the actual ROM, or Black Star, which is your own invention, sort of loosely based off of the inspiration from the Frankenstein comic. But, Black Star is the comic book that Seth steals in the beginning of Seth River, and then it's also a comic book that you put out. So how did you do this? How did you conceive of this? Like,
and by the way, if you hold it up again, I should give Jeff Test. It did the cover. I colored it, but Jeff Test did the cover for that book. And Jeff Test is somebody I discovered on Instagram, and then through a confluence of I fell in love with his work, and then found out that he was from Columbus.
Oh, really?
Fuck yeah, Jeff Test is he was just doing he's just doing comics I probably saw him through my friend Jamie, and then he's married to her sister. So he ended up being married to somebody that I knew from Columbus, who
Wow.
thought I was like has told me since that she was a huge scumbag. She thought I was some like homeless junkie, she's told me. So there's a whole nother narrative about what other people, how I looked in the outside world during this period. Yeah, and I think Jeff is a world-class cartoonist. He's invented his own language. He has a brother named William Test who also draws like him. So they're get them to be, I don't know. I'm sure they will get themselves involved in the festival if they haven't already.
Yeah, I don't know them. That's cool.
Beautiful work.
Cool.
I actually wrote Jonathan Lethem, who he accepted my work into Columbus, America's Best Comics, and he was the editor of the first issue I was in. And I wrote him and I was like, hey, check out this Jeff Test image because I know you like Omega, just Steve Gerber's Omega, and Lethem went crazy for it. And I think he commissioned Jeff to do a piece for him. So that's been a really interesting kind of lightning strikes, like unlikely occurrence.
Yeah.
I discovered this guy, started following him. And then I think I don't know, I probably would have invited him to do the cover anyways, but and he also has a pinup in the issue. It's really funny that he is Columbus. He's the same age as me. I think we're a year apart.
Back to Columbus.
So he is, so I just want to give him credit. The question was more about comics within the comics. Yeah, I think it's I'm very ADD. And the process of learning how to do work involves somebody identifying they had ADD, recommending that I get on ADD drugs. That happened when I was 28, and that was 29 maybe. That changed my whole life. And I was telling somebody about a project I was working on. I was writing a letter to somebody. It was really important, and I described to them. I just have all of these pages strewn about my house, and I just keep on looking at them. I don't know how to organize it. And they said, and so that ended up, they identified the ADD as being a core element of the disorganization. And when you have ADD, you very much have like a sort of a circus of distractions swirling around where the core of where your focus should be. And when you get on the drugs for it, like I did, you're able to zero in on the focus and still have that circus going around. And I think that when I'm working on my projects, I'm always thinking about sort of another narrative circling around it. And it ties into ideas like Mad Magazine, where they used to do the gutter stories, and Harvey Kurtzman, who always had the chicken fat, like the kind of detailed stories going around his art. And then Joe Coleman also had that. When he would do a portrait, he would have like a circle that you could read that wove together a biography or a backstory. And he was kind of saying, look, these two things are equally relevant. When you look at this painting of Charles Manson, looking at him going through the reformatories and his work, images of his tattoos and him discovering acid are all, and images of Jesus with a sword. They all relate. And then you can look at the painting like a comic. You can look at it as like a portrait. So the idea of a frame around a frame around a frame has always been something that has been really true to my heart.
Yeah.
So when I started the way that theft appeared was sort of was I was doing ROM as a adaptation after I got out of art school. I was like, I don't have an original idea, so I'm just going to do an adaptation. I was inspired by Ron Rege's adaptation of a 1960 Spider-Man story, and I still am very interested in that. And anybody who's out there who's trying to get your practice together, I always say, I said recently in an interview, if you don't have an idea, copy something, do an adaptation of an old movie or an old TV show. I actually thought seriously about adapting an episode of Three's Company instead of ROM before I got into ROM. And I always say, like, I'd love to see, Sammy Harcum like adapting like an episode of The Golden Girls or something would be fascinating, or whatever other artist. So so I started doing ROM, and while I was working on ROM, I'm like, this comic came out in '82. I changed it to 80 for the actual finished book. I started thinking about where I was at when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. So Theft kind of popped out of nowhere because I decided to do a sort of a break at the end of the book where I had the character who's reading the comic that you're reading. And then I did 12 pages, about a day in the life, or 18 pages of him going to school where virtually nothing happens, but you get a portrait of who this kid is. And then I went back to him, and when I did Theft for Retrofit Comics, that I wanted to have, I also had him reading comics, and I did Mr. Incompleto, which is supposed to be the comic that the character's reading. And you can buy that separately, and it's supposed to be a companion piece to the book. They actually look kind of nice together, and the covers sort of complement each other. And I continue to do the same thing today.
That's amazing. It just seems like so much I don't know, you have a specialized brain to be able to organize all of that and figure out how it's going to weave together. I don't know if you're working on all of them at once to do that or what, but it's incredible to me. And, another thing that I really love that you do that is like a through line in all of this recent work is how a lot of the same like images and shapes, but also particularly like recognizable characters show up. Like Nancy and Little Orphan Annie's hairstyle appears throughout on like random characters' heads. And then, the sort of Frankenstein long nose face comes up a lot and stuff. Like, is there like a deeper meaning for that? Or is it more of just like a reverential, like Easter egg kind of a thing?
I think it's all of those things, I think, like callbacks, like they teach you that in improv, like you have callbacks, and they're kind of satisfying for the audience. It's more like I teach, I'm always teaching. I'm always teaching beginning classes. And one of my earliest assignments that I got from Tom Hart and Matt Madden and Jessica Abel at SVA was to take two random comics and appropriate, old characters for new ones. So they taught us to take a nose from one and a mouth from another. I don't do that, but I tell people to take one character's hair and another character's face. And if you do it from an unobvious source, like something that's not like, not people isn't hot right now, then it is a nice kind of callback to art history.
Yeah.
If you look at Johnny Ryan's designs for Blecky Yuccarella, he clearly took like Nancy's hair and plopped it on another character's face. Probably Lodi McGee is also a mix of different characters. When you look at other characters, when I have to introduce a new walk-on character, I have no idea how to make them look different just out of my head, or not as much of an idea that I'll get if I look at older comics. So my new comic that I'm doing right now, the one about S.Q. Wilson, I just fully put Annie in the comic because, which is a little bit of slightly creatively bankrupt because I have used her so many times, but I also just it was just like where I was like, it's okay to do what's convenient sometimes.
Oh yeah, and I love it. I mean, it just accentuates that feeling that this is all just some kind of like subconscious, like mixed thing that's coming out on the page, you know? I mean, in a way that your comics always feel so kind of natural and like I've said, like not overly rendered and just really raw. I mean, are we gonna see more Theth stories in the future, or do you feel like you've kind of like played out what you wanted to play with him?
I'm doing right now. I'd say yeah, because I do have. I actually found uh, a comic that I did that is virtually a theft story. Well, the thing is, like when Charles Bukowski wrote, he had Henry Chinaski was his stand-in, and I I think that he'd retell the same stories, and sometimes it wouldn't be Chinaski, it would be like this happened to me. I can't remember. My favorite book by Bukowski is Ham on Rye. Like the
Mhm.
other shit, you can almost discount, especially looking back, and some of it ages badly because
Oh
it's
yeah.
so fucked up and rapey. But like Ham on Rye is a big influence on me. And the bleakness of that book and the fact that so much of it is about almost nothing happening and the
Yeah.
fact that the character fails at the end of the book was a big influence on theft. Right now, so he's somebody who would sometimes I feel like he would drop the pretense and just say this happened to me. I have a book I'm doing now, which is it's virtually theft, a theft story, theft at like 35, which is me like 10, 15 years ago. And it is stylistically, it is not any different from doing the stories, but I stopped calling him theft. It's me. My brothers are in it too, except I changed all their names to respect them. So their names are Sam, Dan, and John, and I changed it to like Jan, Dawn, and Sim. And then with me, I'm in it, but I did that thing that Keith Giffen did when he did Jonah Hex, where he constantly blacked out his face and you could just see the nose. I'm doing, my face is blacked out in every frame, no matter what angle I'm at, which can be tricky to draw.
Huh.
So, okay, cool. We're about out of time, but that's my new project.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I am so glad that we got to do this.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you
too.
for taking the time to talk with me about it. I wish we had a ton more time, but
No, I wish we could. I did the image of us hugging because I knew we were
oh yeah,
have
yay.
the end of the conversation.
Yeah. And so, you know, since this is recording, while we won't be able to have a Zoom webinar Q&A, I want everyone to know who's watching right now that you can right at this moment hop on the CXC Discord channel, and Josh is going to be available to ask questions and chat with you if there's anything you want to discuss about this program. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone who's tuning in, and thank you so much, Josh, for being here with me.
Thank you for inviting me.